for Chapter 10. This is the first of 2 chapters on strategy execution. In this chapter, we focus on the formal side of execution, which is organizational structure. Now, in this chapter, we will discuss the building blocks of organizational structure. We will identify 4 alternative organizational structures. We'll address the factors to consider when selecting the structure for your organization, and we'll close with some comments on corporate restructuring. Now, let's discuss a couple of key points here in strategy implementation before we start. In terms of thinking about the plan for implementation or execution, we should be doing this before we adopt a strategic alternative. Now, granted, some of the plans and some of the details can be worked out after the option is adopted, but you don't want to go into a strategic option without thinking through how it would be executed. I mean, essentially, this idea that you would cross a bridge when you get to it just doesn't work in strategic management. You want to think through how you're going to cross that bridge so that if you select a particular alternative, you can minimize some of the surprises. You also want to keep in mind that the greater the strategic change that's associated with an option or a set of alternatives, the more complex that implementation is likely to be. This doesn't mean that you shouldn't be recommending complicated alternatives. Sometimes those make sense for the company. But just keep in mind that when you are suggesting a major overhaul for the company, you're likely to have some very complex implementation issues along the way. Now, the points or the concepts that we'll be discussing in chapters 10 and 11 will help you think through strategy execution, but they don't provide a clear roadmap for doing so. Strategy execution is really thinking about what you need to be doing or what your company needs to be doing to put a strategy into action. These are some of the principles and concepts that can help you think through it, but your discussion might go in a little bit different direction. So let's talk about organizational structure. Organizational structure refers to the formal means by which work is coordinated in an organization. Note the word formal because this is the official way things are done. Now, if I might ask you, are you currently employed? You might say, yes, I am. I might follow up by saying, well, have you seen the job description that the company provides for your position? I would wager that you probably would say, no, I haven't. Or maybe I saw it, but I can't remember what it said. Well, that's the formal side, but you still know probably what it is you're supposed to be doing in your organization. You still have a sense of what you should be doing, even if you're not aware of the formal designation of those duties. Now, in a new business, each employee often performs lots of different tasks. So if you just have several folks getting together to start a business, they're just doing whatever's necessary. As they say, the manager in the new retail store sweeps the floors at the end of the day. It's a job that needs to be done, and you just don't have anybody perhaps to do that job. Now, we refer to the structure that's adopted by many new businesses, especially small businesses, as a simple structure. This is where the owner-manager is involved in everything. And that's okay as a way of starting, but you need to develop and grow beyond that. And we'll come back to that concept a little bit later when we look at different options for structure. A couple of other concepts that we want to identify in terms of structure. The first is what we call vertical growth. And this is the increase in the length of an organization's hierarchy that tends to happen as a structure develops when a company grows. So in other words, vertical growth is the levels of management. How many levels from the bottom of the organization all the way to the top? The number of employees reporting to each manager represents the manager's span of control. So if I'm a manager and I have 5 subordinates, my span is 5. If you're a manager and you have 10 subordinates, your span is 10. So you would think, well, is a high span good or a low span good? Well, it depends. A high span means you have fewer managers overseeing a particular area of work, and that can cut your costs, but you might not have the control that you want. But span of control is one of those decisions you have to incorporate when you think about those formal relationships involved in structure. Now, a tall organization is comprised of many hierarchical levels and narrow spans of control. And a flat organization has few levels of the hierarchy and a wide span. The reason we call them flat and tall is if you draw an organizational chart, the tall organization will look tall. It will be vertical in terms of depiction, whereas the flat organization tends to flatten out. Now, flat organizations are in vogue. The idea is that you have fewer levels, lots of decentralization, but again, that doesn't mean that's appropriate for every organization. You see, centralization is still an important concept in certain areas. You still want to have a certain level of coordination. In centralized organizations, most of the strategic and operating decisions are made by managers at the top, and they're handed down. Doesn't mean that there's no input from lower levels, but it just means that the primary responsibility occurs at the top of the organization. When you have a decentralized firm, most of the strategic and operating decisions are made by managers at lower or middle levels of the organization. Doesn't mean they go out and do whatever they want. It just means that they have guidelines and they make some of their decisions in terms of how to execute. So a centralized organization might have a very clearly articulated process for dealing with, let's say, returns in a retail store. So what happens when a customer brings a product back and wants a refund? Very specific process, record keeping, all of that. In a decentralized organization, you might allow the managers in those stores to determine what the process would be and who gets a refund, who doesn't, and why. Now, you could see advantages and disadvantages to that. Perhaps thinking through this process is complicated, sophisticated, and maybe this is something you want to have experts do and pass down. But you might see the need for individual or differences in individual businesses. Of course, that can create a problem too if manager in one store has a very liberal policy in terms of returns, and say a manager in another store is very tight with concerns, then that creates confusion among customers. And if customers go to one store and they find that their product is not going to be accepted, maybe they don't have a receipt or it appears to be damaged, they'll just learn to go to the other location where the other manager is likely to accept it. So you can see pros and cons of a centralized or decentralized approach, but these are, again, choices that have to be made in terms of structure. Now let's talk about horizontal growth. Horizontal growth refers to the increase in the breadth of the organization structure. Now, downsizing is something that happens when we eliminate one or more hierarchical levels, and typically middle managers in that area. Often we talk about downsizing workers, but it's not just workers. Sometimes the work that managers do is no longer necessary as well. Well, with these concepts behind us, let's look at 4 structural forms. And these are the options that are available to companies in terms of existing companies or even new companies as they grow. They can choose one of these options. Now we have the functional structure, organized by function, the product divisional structure, organized by products, the geographic divisional structure, organized by geography, and the matrix structure, which is really a combination of the functional and product divisional structures. Now note that the product and geographical divisional structures are also called multi-divisional or M-form structures. So let's talk about each one of these briefly. With the functional structure, each subunit of the organization engages in a firm-wide activities related to a particular function. So that first division of labor that comes down from the top of the organization is along functional areas, and it goes down and gets more specialized. So you might go to a marketing department, and within marketing you have sales and advertising and public relations, and within sales you have sales divisions and regions and all the way down to sales reps. Everything gets more specialized as you go down. The functional structure is the most common that we see in organizations. And it does have the benefits of promoting specialization, and therefore it can be more efficient in a lot of ways. It's very common in new organizations, and it can, again, foster the development of economies of scale. But the second type of structure is what we call the product divisional structure. And here we divide the organization's activities into self-contained entities. Each one of these responsible for producing, distributing, and selling its own products. So the first division here from the CEO down is not to a function, but it's to a product or product category. So you might see an auto producer, for example, goes to trucks and cars as 2 different product lines. And then within each product line, you go into the various functions. So you might have a marketing department for cars and a marketing department for production, or for trucks. Then you'll have a production department in each area, finance, and so forth. You might have some common areas as well, depending on what the organization does, but it essentially divides the functions within the umbrella of different products or product categories. Now here the focus is on products, the real source or success in the firm. Pinpointing the responsibility for products and losses is a lot easier with this structure, because one of the questions you fundamentally have in an organization is which products or services are making money and which are losing. And if you've used a product divisional structure, you tend to be able to make those decisions more effectively. Now, cost accounting allows us to divide costs in different areas, but it has its shortcomings. For example, let's just say your company pursues that proverbial ad on the Super Bowl. So you've got millions of dollars spent on this advertisement. Well, if you have different products, how would you cost that particular ad across the different products? Would all products be costed equally in terms of that ad? Would they be costed in terms of the price of the products or the level of sales? How do you determine how much of that advertising expense should be applied to each product or product category? It can be difficult, but in a product divisional structure, you would have each category making its own marketing decision, so it would be much easier to do. Now, in a geographic divisional structure, the activities and personnel are grouped by specific geographic locations. So that first division from the CEO is not to function or to product, but to region. So you might have a North American division, a European division, an African division, an Asian division. Or maybe within the US, you might have a Southern or Southeastern, a Midwestern, Northeastern, Southwestern, what have you. But it's divided by geography. Now, this doesn't make sense for all companies. It does make sense when there are substantial geographic differences. For example, banking and insurance is heavily regulated. You see a lot of different rules and regulations as you go from one state to the next. So for this reason, you might have different divisions of insurance companies operating in different states in the U.S. because of the regulatory environments. Or maybe different types of products are demanded. If you have, say, food products, maybe some in the warmer climates and others in colder climates. So you might break it down based on region in order to emphasize the different products that occur in each region. So again, the point here is that the geographic divisional structure doesn't work for all companies, but it might make sense for some. Well, the final structure we discuss here is the matrix structure, and this is a combination of functional and product divisional structures. So essentially, you start with what looks like a functional structure, but because the work is handed down on a project basis, you don't have individuals necessarily reporting only to those individuals in those functions. So for example, if we have a project, say a software development project, we might draw somebody from production, somebody from marketing, maybe somebody from finance, or even some specialty area of coding in our company that brings a skill to bear that we need to fulfill that particular project. The idea here is that we need to bring people with different skills together in order to complete the type of work that we have. And in some organizations, that's necessary, especially very complicated, high-tech organizations where people work on teams. So you might be a marketing person and you might have a position in the functional area, maybe where you report to a boss in marketing, but your job is really to work on 4 or 5 different projects, and you have different teams that you work with on each of these projects. So the problem with this, of course, is that you would like to have a clearly defined order in the organization where each individual reports to only one superior. In this situation, you might have multiple project team leaders. So you have lots of different things going on and be pulled in different directions. But the advantage is that you're able to focus individuals with expertise in different areas on complicated problems. So the matrix structure is not for everybody, but it certainly can work in a lot of companies. It's very trendy. A lot of organizations move in this direction, but again, traditional manufacturers, service organizations tend not to go in this direction unless there is a level of sophistication required in terms of the type of work they do. So how do we assess an organization's structure? Now, each of these structures that we just discussed, the functional, the product divisional, the geographic divisional, and the matrix structures are pure forms. If you look at a structure in an existing organization, you'll see some type of blend or deviation. Typically happens. But this gives you an overall sense for the four basic approaches. And there are other approaches as well. They're really beyond the scope of this book. But keep in mind that different structures can be combined based on the particular needs of the organization. So what do you consider when selecting a structure? Well, there are several things you can think about. One is the level of corporate involvement in business unit operations. In some corporations, the top management really is very involved in what goes on at the business level. What about the compatibility of the structure with the corporate profile and the corporate strategy? The idea being that the structure should fit strategy. Now, should you change the strategy to fit the structure? Should you change the structure to fit the strategy? That's just an ongoing debate. It's been going on for decades. The notion is that sometimes you have to work within the existing structure in the short term, but you'd like to modify that structure over the long term if necessary in order to fit with a strategic change that you want to pursue. What about the number of hierarchical levels in the organization? If you have a lot of hierarchy that's required, that can influence the type of structure that you select. What about the extent to which the structure permits the appropriate grouping of activities or the effective coordination? In each organization, you'll have a different situation. And finally, what about your organization's approach towards centralization and decentralization of authority? If you're a decentralized organization, you might want to pursue a flat organization. Maybe you want to pursue a taller organization if centralization and control is really important. Now, let's talk about the corporate involvement in business unit operations. I mentioned that in the previous slide. The extent to which corporate managers are involved in the business unit operations can vary significantly. And sometimes it can be helpful because you want some degree of coordination. So if your firm owns multiple business units, you want there to be some type of coordination. In fact, some of it is just economically important. If you have several restaurants, for example, or several restaurant chains as business units, you want to be able to provide a structure that allows you to benefit from synergy. Sometimes you have the same deliveries coming to different business units. And sometimes this involvement is seen as a stabilizing force, and the top executives in business units are happy to have that support. But more times than not, it seems that business unit managers refer to corporate in less than a positive light. Sometimes think that corporate leaders should just stay out and provide basic direction and let the business unit managers decide what needs to happen strategically within each unit. This can vary, again, across organizations. Now, when a firm decides to change structures, we refer to that as corporate restructuring. Now, technically, the term means a change in structure, but sometimes it's used to cover a wide range of changes. And it can also include things like realigning divisions of the firm, reducing the amount of cash under the discretion of top managers, and even acquiring or divesting business units. Now, progressive firms will restructure when it becomes clear a change is necessary. The idea here is you don't wait until the company is failing before you restructure. You should try to be assertive, and if you see a problem coming or if you see an environmental change occurring down the road, go ahead and make that decision up front. That's really difficult to do because when things are going well, often it's difficult to sell a restructuring plan throughout your company. Nonetheless, restructuring is common in large organizations. It happens all the time, and you should do your best not to delay it until the survival becomes a big issue. So let's close our discussion of structure and talk about the forms of electronic commerce that we see. Some terminology we used on the e-commerce side, because many companies are involved to some degree or another in more than one of these forms. And we'll think in terms of forms of electronic commerce by looking at the offer initiator and the offer recipient. That will make sense as we walk through that. So if businesses propose offers to other businesses, we'll call that business to business or B2B. This is the largest form of electronic commerce that we see. The most common to many consumers is what we call business to consumer or B2C. Example here would be Amazon.com or many of the other online retailers we do business with. It's the most popular form for a lot of consumers. Many are not aware that there's a lot of B2B going on, but B2B is the largest percentage of electronic commerce. But we also have business to government, where businesses offer their services to government. Many governments procure just about everything online today. We have consumer to business or C2B, and this is where consumers actually submit offers to businesses. Not that common, but we've seen it in the past. The former Priceline model was famous for this, and in years past, you could go to Priceline and you could just put a bid on a particular airfare. Let's say you wanted to fly from New York to San Francisco and you're willing to pay $100 on a certain day. Well, you put the bid, and then if an airline picks up the bid, you get the ticket. It's sort of an interesting approach here where consumers go to businesses instead of the other way around. Not as common today, but it still exists. And finally, you have the consumer to consumer or C2C approach. Good example here is eBay. eBay doesn't sell products per se. They're just an intermediary between individuals and companies that do. So consumers are approaching consumers in many instances. Now, there are a lot of companies that sell on eBay as well, and that would be a different category. But for the instances where individuals sell products to other individuals, eBay would be categorized as C2C. Now, many traditional firms are integrating e-commerce into their existing business models. This has occurred widely, and we refer to this sometimes as clicks and bricks. Clicks being the internet side of the business and bricks being the brick and mortar side as well. The idea here is to build that synergy and to create a structure that allows the online part of the business to leverage the traditional side and vice versa. Sometimes this works, sometimes it's difficult, but most companies are finding they have to pursue this at least to some extent. Well, this concludes our audio commentary for this chapter.